Good. So this talk may be a little bit different from some of the other ones that you've been seeing, although I think each talk is a little different from other talks. And we'll see how the slides come out. So apologies for that. Some things are small, but I thought the screens would be bigger. Can you hear me? The sound's kind of a little bit here. It kind of comes and goes. Okay, good. So as Imran started to tell you, this is actually work by a group of people from different disciplines. This is the kind of thing that we do at the Santa Fe Institute. And the idea is really to ask, we have fun in science by trying to ask some of the hardest questions, some of the most interesting questions in science, and trying to find ways, sometimes non-conventional ways, to start to answer them. So cities are special today for several reasons. First, there's sort of one of the age-old problems of why is it that humans tend to congregate on these large ensembles, and what is it that we do there? And so these questions have been around certainly since the very beginning of any rational thought that we have a record for. But at the same time, what's making it possible, I hear some feedback, sorry, that's a little bit annoying. What's making it possible is one of the themes of this conference, namely the fact that it's only been maybe in the last 10 years, you can open an exception there for one or two nations, where we've started having data on cities, on not just one city, but on systems of cities around the world. And especially it's becoming interesting to look at cities in places that are developing very fast, where in some sense we have the most direct indications of what cities are and why they grow and why they might decay. And so that's the sort of problems I'm interested in, and I'll try to show you how we go about thinking about them. And in showing you that, hopefully there'll be some interesting lessons as to how data and analysis of data contributes to sort of create meaning. That's really what we're after. And at the same time, how that really might bring important lessons for how we think about the way we live and perhaps who we are as humans. So perhaps the slides may show up decently, but we'll see. So this is one famous photograph of Landsat satellite. This I think is from 1997, and there's a series of this for the whole world about, and it's basically the world at night. You just see where humans are in the sense that they use lighting to light up essentially their cities and their infrastructure. And so what you see obviously is that there are, so this is North America obviously, though there are in the US and Canada maybe 350 million people, they're all very concentrated. They're concentrated on just a few urban centers. And there's a lot of empty space obviously. And this is true of everywhere, of Europe, increasingly of Asia and Africa, and it's already true also of Latin America. So why is it that we choose to live like this? If this has happened spontaneously, and it's probably the greatest human movement and natural movement that ever happened in biology throughout the eons of evolution, why is this happening? What is it that brings people together? And what is it that sometimes also brings us apart? So the numbers are really quite staggering. You've probably seen this. This is sort of the fodder of many reports, and some more political, some more perhaps sociological. But here's one example. This is a report for the IMF, and it's just basically saying something that you might have heard, that probably in 2007, 2008, we don't know exactly because the numbers for many developing nations are not very well known, humanity became more than 50% urban. That's mostly because Asia started urbanizing very quickly in the last couple of decades. China is just about to crossing the threshold, and many other nations like India and nations in Africa are becoming very urbanized. This happens now against in a way that is very reminiscent to the first great wave of urbanization that happened during the Industrial Revolution. And so one of the reasons why I was excited when Imran invited me to come here is that I had never been to Manchester, and it's obviously one of the icons of what happened in the first wave and what happens after. So I was very interested to be here and see how the city's doing and have sort of a first-hand experience of what it might have looked like before. So So the question is, why are all these curves going up? Why is this such a pervasive force? What's happening in China is very different from what's happening in Africa. For example, China is going through a more or less classical industrial revolution with today's technology, not 150 years ago, but still an industrial evolution. Whereas when you look at Europe or North America, or you look at Africa, cities are driven by very different economic forces. Ethnically, they're very different. The waves of migration, the connections are very different, but yet people choose to come together. So why does this happen? So what you see, one of the great puzzles that's still unexplained, but it's obvious, is that if you're interested in cities, I guess many of you are, the great mystery is the mystery of migration. Why is it that most people that come to cities only grow when cities grow explosively. That was true of Manchester 150 years ago or before that, and it's true now of cities in China or India. Cities grow through migration. There may be larger growth rates due to births. This is actually fairly uncommon. But when a city grows explosively, it grows because people come. And these people are, in vast numbers, basically people that choose to stop pursuing a livelihood of subsistence agriculture and become urban dwellers looking for jobs. So the question is, why is it that people leave their urban environments, usually urban subsistence, and choose a life in cities that, at least today, when we look around the world, when we don't look at developed nations, but if you looked at developed nations 150 years ago, you'd have exactly the same picture, that you would see that people choose to live in what looks like squalor and urban poverty. And so this is one of the questions that has been most misunderstood in all the social sciences and economics. There is a sense in which billions of people today prefer a life of opportunity and sacrifice, in some cases, in large urban centers as compared to a life of subsistence agriculture. And in some sense, what we understand, a lot of it from ethnographic studies, is that they choose to do this because of a sense of opportunity. That if they stay in the countryside, there's a sense that nothing will happen, and probably, in many cases, you're isolated, so you're not connected. This is a little bit changing with technologies, but the fact is it's not changing fast enough, and it's probably any change that can happen there is slower than what you can experience in an urban center. And at the same time, what you find is that people in cities are actually very well connected. They're connected by necessity, of course. They're connected by traditional networks that have to do with their places of origin, their ethnicity, but increasingly they're also connected through new technology like cell phones and other things that we can start to measure. So there's a sense in which what people are looking for is change, both for them and for subsequent generations. And that change in opportunity is created by cities. So how is it that that happens then? So this happened before. I mentioned this again, and of course Manchester is iconic for that. And what I wanted, this is probably impossible to see, but and it's a little cut, but these pictures are all very idealized. So there's an idealization of English countryside. There's sort of a very cleaned up watercolor of the mills that used to be just a couple blocks that way on, I think, River Street. And there's a description published in 1945, written in the 1840s. I said 1845, I think, of Friedrich Engels that basically changed the world. This is the first observation. It's representative of a whole wave in economics and sociology that started observing how people that came to cities lived. And it's on the one hand factual, and at the same time it expresses an extreme misunderstanding of the social and economic forces why people chose that life. There are many things one could say about that, but the fact is that people still chose to come. And basically this is the idea that cities, though they realized certain economic forces that were perceived not to be in everyone's interest, that these created conditions of life, of social life, that were pathological, that basically led to poverty, squalor, and many other social conditions, and that this was something to be avoided. And I'll come back to this later, because while some of that was obviously true, it is confronting those problems in cities that led to many of the processes that we understand as development in human societies. So But that sort of first wave of observations, of studies, which were not quite completely scientific, gave birth to much of economics, to sociology, and also to political movements that, of course, changed the 20th century. It's a great question as we look at the world today, when the movements of people are on a scale that's much larger than what happened 150 years ago in now developed nations, to wonder what might happen. And I'll come back to that towards the end. So the real question, so this is all things that you probably have known, but the real question then is, what are cities? You know, what is it that they're doing that is so attractive to humans universally through time when the conditions are right, and also throughout every nation, although each city is doing different things. So, you know, one answer, just to go back to the very beginning of our written record, is due to the debate between these two gentlemen, Plato and Aristotle, and they were just trying to understand in that time, remember, there were very few nations as we understand them today. Every nation was a city. And so Plato, of course, as usual, wrote very ideologically about things. And Aristotle was more interesting. He was more of a biologist, of course. And so he was somebody who was trying to classify all the kinds of systems of governments and social systems that he could see in cities around mostly Greece and the Greek world back then. And he concluded, after looking at all these different cities, including places like Sparta, were very iconic, and it were basically a Nazi state of a sort, a dystopia of a sort, and his own, the place where he lived, Athens, though he never became a citizen. And so he basically concluded this grand statement that you see as the beginning of almost every book in political philosophy and political science, which is that he said men, the Greek word is actually human, is by nature a political animal. And more so, I added it a little bit, than bees and any other gregarious animals. So mark the words, though, because political, of course, you know where it comes from. It means polis. It comes from polis, from the city. So what it means is that basically it goes on to say that essentially it's only in the city that the potential of every human is realized by our own interdependence and exchange. And so that's telling you something, but of course it's a little bit circular. But it became iconic and the origin of many analogies. So for a long time we thought of what cities are in terms of biological analogies. And there are many such analogies, from organisms to social colonies with animals. So for example, here's an ant colony. And the question is then, is this fundamentally different from a human large city? And of course, this also exposes an interesting other theme, which is that, of course it is in form, okay, but form should really not be the answer. Maybe this is just bigger, okay, maybe it has new technology. But the question really is this just basically an overgrown anthill of a sort, or is there something fundamentally different? And the answer, as you will see, is that there is something fundamentally different, something that's, as far as we can tell, uniquely human, and that we invented. So this is one of the first things that will tell you that there's something special about what we came up with, sort of as a species. So I'll show you several of these. These may be a little bit hard to see, but hopefully not, but I'll tell you what they mean. So what you see here is just a plot of, let's see if I go here, it may help, of per capita biomass production. So this is basically the currency of biology. It just means how productive a biological system is if you're producing essentially biomass. It means you need to convert energy into your own biomass. And on the x-axis, you basically just have the mass of colonies, which you can see as the number of individuals, and these are for anthills, okay? So what happens here is something simple. As you get bigger ant colonies, they get more productive. They mean they produce more biomass, but they produce a little bit less with each ant that you add. So what happens is that the system stops growing. It just is limited, fundamentally limited. And it's limited by its ability to explore the environment. It's only able to explore the environment that's immediately around it under its technology, so to speak. So it is because of this. This is what we call sublinear scaling. It means that the product, essentially the economic productivity of this insect colony grows more slowly than the number of individuals. And as such, it must stop. It cannot go on. So this is typical of biology. It just means biologists and ecologists talk about this in terms of carrying capacity. So you just have a system that exists in space, and in space it's able to derive the resources that exist there, and it can grow until it does so, and then that's it. You know, normal, equilibrium with nature, all that's good. But humans are different. So if you look at human cities, you'll find that we've transcended, at least to the extent possible by the laws of physics and the limits of the planet, those local limitations. And that is really what made human systems and cities in particular special. When you look, for example, just from history, when you look at where the large cities of antiquity got their food, you will find pretty quickly that Athens, for example, used to get much of its corn from the Black Sea. And Rome, of course, would get much of its corn from Sicily and Egypt and many other places. And these were part of the reasons for their expansion. So there were elaborate systems to actually start getting the resources and the trade and sometimes the organization and military occupation that came with that organization. And so this slide is a little dull, but I'll just tell you a little bit about how. So there's sort of these biological analogies, but as you start putting the numbers together, as I'll show you the contrast to human social systems in a second, you'll find immediately that they're basically turned upside down. That humans were able to do something that transcends those biological limits. And this probably may or may not interest you, but there are basically fundamental ways in which people in different disciplines, I alluded to their birth before, start thinking about cities and human systems in general. In economics, you tend to think about production. So these models would almost over 100 years old, and they were very much inspired by just looking at the landscape of Manchester, what it used to be back then. The fact that things came in, things were cotton, wool, and water and other things were people, labor. And then you get something out, which usually has a monetary value, and you can try to characterize that relationship. But this misses much of the point about why people are there in the first place, and how is it that technology changes, which in the end is really the engine by which cities are able to continue to find resources and find new ways of creating them and creating new ideas that are able to have the system continue. In sociology, the emphasis tends to be on this. You see a lot of this now in technology, you know, sort of on steroids, so to speak, which is that we create all these networks of things that are connected, usually across a few dimensions that we can measure, Twitter or some, you know, Flickr, something like that, some sort of relationships that are measurable through technology, perhaps cell phones. But in some sense, that is telling you about certain kinds of interactions, but it's not capturing, on the one hand, the whole realm of our interactions. It's not capturing typically our intentionality. In any case, there are several interesting insights from sociology that come back. I'll come back to some of them. But one of them is that when you, in modern sociology, it's more classical sociology, one of the things you find is that when you try to look at how people are connected, despite, you know, what I see around in this room, what you find is that most people really don't like to live around people that are very different from them. This is typical of the recent American experience, where cities became much more, people became much more mobile in cities, due mostly to large infrastructural projects of building roads and things. And when you do that, you just find that people segregate themselves. They segregate themselves first according to economic lines, which was a surprise to some researchers. They thought that ethnic lines and racial lines in the US, which are strong, would be the first indication of that, but they're not. It's economics. And then, of course, other ethnic and other domains. So there's a sense in which, if you take all that sort of as evidence, if cities exist, they exist because they transcend those sort of forces by something else. And that something else is basically our economic and cultural things that bring us together. The reason why we're here is that hopefully we're exchanging information. There's something that you'll learn today and that I'll learn today that will make us a little bit better. At least on the average, that should be true. And so that becomes interesting. And finally, the idea of urban planning, and certainly this is also talking about mostly classical urban planning, is that you could design space, you could design a city, mostly space, that would determine the way people live, that would at least influence it strongly. And this has had a strong but very checkered history throughout most of the 20th century. And it's essentially been proven wrong and disastrous. So every major architect in the world basically played God with trying to redesign a city to be better. And in almost every case, this failed. I think there's a new strategy to think about why that failed and to think about what is it that actually brings people together. Most of the reason is that because you imagine a city that in which people, typically you have something like, famously, this is very iconic, the Ville Radieuse, one of the first projects of this kind by Le Corbusier. They inspired many projects that follow afterwards. The idea was to destroy sort of medium density small buildings where people actually have economic networks and ways of interacting with people that are different from them, and they're also like them in many ways, to something where you become, essentially you break the city apart in terms of its functional parts, and you just find an ideal place to people to live. Usually you have a bunch of pale-looking people enjoying or pretending to enjoy some gardens and things where there's no one outside, and this has basically been disastrous. But in any case, we'll see. So the problem of cities is essentially this, is that it involves many different ingredients all at once. This is a quote from Jane Jacobs, who probably is the counterpoint to this last idea of sort of the idealized planning and the city of infrastructure. And she was writing in the late 50s and the early 60s. She was not an academic, but she became very influential in the way, particularly now, today, as we move away from this sort of deterministic design of cities, we try to understand sort of small neighborhoods and that sort of interaction. But she lived in the East Village in New York. It's changed much from what it used to be. It's probably very hard to see, but these are basically a small building sort of shop at the ground floor sort of environment, which she found very congenial to urban life of all kinds. But the point is that she was not an academic, but she understood this, that there are many things that you have to get right in order to understand how a city works. And if you only get certain aspects of the city, even if you were to understand them well, you might miss some of the other ones. And there's no simple causality in which the infrastructure determines social behavior, or even that social behavior necessarily tells you what infrastructure you should have, though those are connected. And so you need to start understanding that better. And this is what we started to do, is to basically to look at many urban quantities, because the data is now available, and trying to make sense of what a city is in terms of the integration of infrastructure and many socioeconomic quantities. So what is it that we know? So now we moved ahead a little bit, and this is more recent work, but this is still work in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And there were all these indications that, first of all, we recognize cities. You can go to cities around the world, the language, the food, the currency may be different, but you sort of know what to do. You know how it works, and so there's a sense that there's a certain universality to what a city is. And so we know things like this, that when a city doubles in size, its economic productivity per capita increases by about 15%. This is measured in terms of value added. That's essentially the same thing as GDP. This is measured from manufacturing quantities. But it turns out that this is a universal fact of cities. So larger cities are more productive per capita. And this is sort of the upside down of what I showed you for the ant colony. This tells you that cities do some sort of magic that allows you to actually grow and be more productive at the same time. So the other thing you also see, this is pretty universal, is that when you double the size of a city, you basically get about the same amount, 15, 16, between 10 and 20% increase on a per capita incidence of violent crime. So what do these things have to do with each other? Well, they're made by people together, but this is part of the puzzle. When you look at many of these urban quantities, as you will see, almost everything that's socioeconomic gets amplified, gets sped up. And when you see that, you'll just start understanding that what cities do is to promote interactions between people, both good and bad. And they do that in a special way. So let me guide you through that. This is probably impossible. It has a little bit of math. But the idea is that when we started seeing this, the mathematical expression, what I just told you in those very simple relationships, that you double something, you get more than double, or less than double, but you don't get just double, is this idea of self-similarity or scale invariance. So the idea is that then, if you have a system, any system that is made of parts, and that you just change its size and you get transformation that amplifies or reduces what you get, but it does so in a way that does not depend exactly on what scale you started from. So if you start with a city of 5,000 and double it, you get 10,000. You get a 15% increase in economic productivity, but you could have started with a city of 1 million and double it, and also have gotten a 15% over what you started from. So it doesn't depend where you start, if a city had 5 million or a million. So this is what we call the urban scaling hypothesis. Scaling just refers to this fact that cities exist in a continuum. And so this has interesting implications. This is true for all the data that we know of, and we know now of a lot of data. It's also sort of true in the sense that if you go to a very small town, its economy should not just disappear. So there should be something there that's basically are the seeds for what happens in a large city, and you want to characterize what that continuum is. Similarly, when you go to a very large city, that very large city, though fascinating as it is probably very much understandable from what you know from smaller cities. So if you flew around the UK or were in a train and there was a city you didn't know of, and if I told you more or less what its size was, its population size, you'd get a good idea about what would be in that city. That's essentially the idea. And so this led us to identify two reasons. They're not entirely new reasons. They're reasons that particularly economics knew a little bit about. But there are essentially two reasons why large cities exist and why larger and larger cities tend to happen. And these are that larger cities are, as I told you, economically more productive, and that larger cities also save on certain forms of material infrastructure. Usually the second one is emphasized. You just think of a city and you think that you can have, for example, public transportation that serves a lot of people, and by doing that you may save energy. That's true, but that by itself is not enough to build a city. There are many examples of building infrastructure before people came. That doesn't work. People don't necessarily come. And there are many more examples, particularly of fast-growing cities. That was true of Manchester again and through its history, but it's particularly true now of cities in developing countries. And every country was a developing country at some point, where people come first and then the infrastructure comes, sort of by necessity. And so in that sense, people can be the infrastructure, but the infrastructure cannot be people. And the city is basically people and their interactions. But the infrastructure is important in making economic activity that is viable in the sense of being profitable enough that it can stay and can keep attracting people. So let me tell you a little bit about the evidence. I think it's interesting. So this is a lot of the work we've done. I'll just give you a few highlights. But this is, I don't have a lot of data for the UK, partly because the administrative system in UK in terms of disaggregated local authorities is very complicated, and I don't fully understand it. But there are basically all kinds of authorities for health, for economics, for voting, and they're all a little bit different. So I'll show you mostly data for the US and Japan and a few others. So what you have here is basically wages for the United States. Each point is a city. The largest city there is New York, LA, Chicago, and so forth, all the way down. These are called metropolitan areas. This is partly why it's difficult to look at the UK, because there are some definitions, but there's no complete agreement. Metropolitan areas are attempts to define a city that's sort of the organic city, the interacting city. They're defined through commuting flows, and they try to include everybody that could interact in the city. That has a job, they may live far away, but if they have a fast transportation link, and a lot of people in that place move into the downtown and other parts of the city, then that's included. Whereas if there's a part of the city where people don't come and work in the center or in other parts of the city, then that's not included. So that's sort of an interacting population definition of the city. And so what you have here is, again, that this number, 1.12, is larger than 1. So that means you have these 12% in this case, premium on what happens as you increase the size of the city. This is why large cities are expensive, because everybody on average, not everybody, but everybody on average is making a little bit more money, and so prices equilibrate with that. So, for example, housing is more expensive. That's the first thing, if there's not crazy credit market. And usually what you have then is that this drives the prices of everything. So what you get is this sort of this acceleration of how fast you make money. All these are rates, the amount of money that you make per unit time, a year or a month or a day. And they're also sort of there's sort of this magnification of economic productivity and economic production. So what you find is that if you take this across a very large urban system, such as the United States or Japan or the UK for that matter, then you find an amazing thing, that the economy of Tokyo, for example, is larger than that of India. or Brazil. It's similar to the economy of Brazil. So Tokyo is 35 million people, and the economy of New York is larger than that of Russia. So much for the Cold War right there, right? So there's just a sense in which if you can produce is not quite the right word, if you can allow these places to thrive, then you really have these amazing economic engines. And they have certain advantages and disadvantages for sure, but this is their essential character. And it's basically one of the most important issues of what cities do. And in Japan, you see something similar. The number is 1.10, but you get these 10% premium again and so forth. The green dots, if you can see them, are provinces, and that has to do with the units of analysis. I'd be happy to talk about any of you, about this. So I don't want to give you many tables and so forth, but I want to give you an impression that this is very universal. So whatever you look, you find more or less the same effect. The number is always 10 to 20%. It's curious, for example, to look at the EU because it's now a very integrated system, so it's full of noise and the number's larger. But that's because it's dominated by sort of large countries that have large cities like the UK and France, where these cities are quite rich compared to countries that have smaller cities. But in any case, that's less important. You always see this number between 10 and 20%, whatever you look. You can look at China, where the level of development at present is very different, and the set of economic activities are very different from what happens, for example, in the United States or in Britain. And you can look at Brazil, where, again, the level of development is different, but also the composition of economic productivity is very different. It's not essentially a country going over an industrial revolution. It's a country that depends a lot on services and on natural resources. So whatever you look, you find this effect. And this is sort of a law. We sort of call it a law. It's an empirical law. It's something that we're working to understand exactly why these 10 over 1, so 1.10, come from. But it's basically something that you observe over time. This is personal income in the United States. The fact that all those colors fall in the same line is what's telling you that's universal, essentially. And it's from 1969 to 2008. So it doesn't really matter. So you have to adjust for the baseline. So what happens is that the nation as a whole is changing its wealth. There's inflation, there's economic growth, and all kinds of things. But the relationship between what you expect in the largest city versus the smallest city is the same. And this is also true across nations. So what you have here is China, Brazil, Germany, and the US. And you find essentially the same relationships. We were a little bit bothered. You probably cannot see very well. If you see these points, those are very large Chinese cities, Shanghai and Beijing. And those cities actually look like they're a bit not on the line. But it's very interesting. China has, for good and bad, has an interesting policy in terms of controlling its internal migration. Namely, it has resident permits, so you cannot just go to a place and work, officially anyway, without a residency permit. And what happens is that in the very large cities, there's of course, economic forces are always stronger than the government. And so what happens is that you have about 5 million people unaccounted for by that system in a place like Shanghai or Beijing and other large cities. So those points really should move. If you account for those 5 million people, they move to the line. So let me tell you, so this is sort of amazing, right? Because you're just getting, I'm not implying that size is a measure of just the success of a city. You cannot just put a lot of people together and hope for the best. But the fact is, if a place is large, it usually means that it was able to realize a whole history and a whole integration of economic activities that allowed it this sort of increases in productivity. Those increases in productivity, as I'll say a little bit towards the end, are predicated, of course, on a whole urban system where you, increasingly in the history of Britain, but also nowadays in terms of international relations, where you exchange also agricultural products, raw materials, etc., with other places. And these things, and it's also predicated on the efficiencies in which we extract this. And I'll come back to that in a second, and so let me not yet talk about that. So the other thing you see is sort of the development of infrastructure. I told you there was savings in infrastructure. This is sort of something that's much more tangible, and I think we all have a feeling for. But it's interesting to measure it, because in some sense, these are the mirror effects of each other. And it's the fact that there are certain very general physical things that are happening to the city that allow you to save in infrastructure. So on the one hand, people want to be together, so they're denser. And it's because they're denser that you can start servicing them with economies of scale. So most of what you find is savings in material infrastructure, things like the length of roads, the length of pipes, the length of wires, and as I'll show you a little bit, transportation and carbon emissions. So this is data for Germany. And it's, I like to show this data set because it's very interesting because it has a bunch of things happening all at the same time. So you might expect that, so in Germany you basically have what we call superlinear growth in consumption. So very much like a social quantity, you need more energy in a larger city on a per capita basis. It's 0.09 in this case. But there are other things happening. So at the same time you see a saving in cable. So it means that the number is less than 1. It's 0.88. So the fact that the city's the equivalent or the analogous quantity to traffic congestion and other things. So you save on roads. Actually, people tend to have fewer cars, but you still have more congestion and more dissipative losses. So this is telling, those dissipative losses are basically the interface of the social system wanting to go as fast as possible and the infrastructure wanting to save as much as possible. And what cities do is to try to equilibrate this in a way that makes some sort of sense, but obviously over time and in each place that's not always achieved. And if you look at, for example, length of water pipes in Japanese cities, which is an arcane quantity, I know, but you'll find, again, amazing stuff. There's a saving. That number is less than 1. But you'll find that basically with the tubes that, wire up or connect Tokyo, you could go about 3 times around the Earth. So when you think about also human infrastructure and human investments in construction, there's really nothing like looking at a very large city. London, of course, was the first modern city to have a true large-scale sewage system and water system, but that was built in, I think, starting to be built in something like 1864 after debilitating and horrible cholera epidemics, and that was 19 centuries after Rome had pretty good, with different technology, same technology. And it's very curious that that happened also as both cities crossed about the threshold of having about 1 million people. It's curious, I'm probably running out of time, I shouldn't go on these tangents, but it's very interesting to think about that Rome actually had a very different technology, and because of that, I told you about efficiencies and how these predicate the ability of creating this economic value. The money is coming from there. But in Rome, basically, the technology was the technology of irrigation. So what you did was to flood the city. You'd bring water in through ducts and things that were basically built from irrigation technology. You would just have fountains that were running all the time. So in Rome, a citizen would use about 60 times the amount of water that we use today. And that's the kind of thing that you find throughout the development of cities and history, is that with lighting technology, with water, with all kinds of things, all these things are being really, I mean, you really have to look at historical time to see these big changes. But you see that increasingly cities are predicated on these savings and better technology, and at the same time they produce all this new economic value. So the other thing that happens is that these increases in social interaction are creating also potentials for violence. So we're now starting to study the long-term evolution of violence in cities. Again, as you might imagine, this is something for which there's not a lot of data, and the data is not always reliable. But there's some data that's becoming to be reliable, and we have now a student who's looking at several countries in Latin America. He's from Colombia, where the history of cities is very much involved with organized crime and changes of that. But what you find in established cities, urban systems, is that larger cities just have more crime. And it's also larger cities where the solutions to crime are first invented. So if you go again throughout the history of metropolitan police in the UK, or for that matter, if you look at what just happened in the last maybe 15 years in New York, or now in São Paulo and other cities, you find that it is in large cities that crime is basically, that solutions to fight crime are found first. So there's sort of this arms race where the possibilities to create crime, and usually when we talk about violent crime, it's organized crime, versus what happens in terms of organization to fight crime, tends to be intertwined. But there's nothing that unravels a city faster than insecurity. And I was talking to some people about Manchester and what happened in the 70s. And this is very much resonant to what happened to US cities in the 70s. A lot of this, when a city is not doing well, for other reasons. Typically, there is also the possibility that it might just blow up in terms of its organized crime taking a stronger role and then basically making parts of the city unlivable. So this is Japan. Japan has, I could talk about this for a long time, but Japan has basically a crime rate that's much, much, much lower than the US. I think there was something like 19 homicides by gunshot in Japan in 2007. Whereas there are probably 19 of those in Washington, D.C. every day or something. Probably not quite, but something like that. So there's a big difference, but the relationship between cities of different sizes still persists. So this is what gives us a lot of confidence that what we're finding here is very interesting. So, and all these things, particularly the socioeconomic things, when you look at them, they're basically rates. They're things that happen in time. So what you find is that one point of view that you can take is that what's happening is that life is just happening faster. Things are happening, you know, it's your experience. I always thought, actually, when I lived in London, I was a little wrong, but it's essentially the right insight, that when you live in a large place full of different people, you basically experience more things. So the pace of time, the time that's relevant, is really the time between things happening to you or opportunities happening to you. And by that measure, basically time's just ticking faster. And it's ticking faster essentially by the same measure. So you see that, for example, in the way people walk. So people walk a little faster in cities whenever you can measure that. So you see that all these effects are going together. And where they all come from, so one of the questions is where they all come from. So the economic parts actually come from new things. I'll tell you a little bit more about where the acceleration comes from, but I'm running out of time, so I'll have to speed up a little bit. So what you find is that increasingly we understand that if you want more money, you need more ideas. So this is probably one of the themes of why we're here. And I don't want to be crass about money being just the important thing, but I think we all know that economic growth is important for a city or a nation to do well. We all sort of in the throes of what's happening presently around the world about that. And it's become, this is an idea that goes back again to observations of Manchester 150 years ago by Alfred Marshall. But there's this idea that things concentrate in cities, partly because what cities do is not really to produce new material things that save on other material inputs like cloth out of, you know, wool and cotton and so forth. That's important. But the most important thing is the way you make cloth. It's the algorithm. It's the invention of the process. And sort of as technologies change, that's become more and more apparent. So what you find is that the wealth of cities is predicated on their ability to create new things. And we've been trying to measure this and to export them. That's important. So one of the things that's hard to do is that it's easy to have sort of a bunch of interesting people hanging out together and having fun. But the idea is that places that do quite well, they're able to sort of export what they do to other places. So we've been trying to measure this. And one of the things you find, again, is that the fact that you have more economic productivity in larger places also means that essentially comes from the fact that you have a different mixture of people. So you have more people that are involved in what's been known as what's been called creative or super creative activities. This is famous terminology by Richard Florida. But so you see basically this increase that larger cities also tend to have a different mixture of population. They tend to have a mixture of professions and people doing those professions that favors creative activities, which by definition are essentially also better paid. And so one of the ways in which you can look at how a city does, so this is relevant mostly for modern cities, and this again are US cities, and it's a little cut on that side, but you may be able to see that. I don't know, it's a bit of a mess, sorry. So is just to see who's going where. Again, I was talking to some people here, and I was asking, you know, Manchester looks like a very interesting city. I was walking around the North End, all these young people looking like they're doing interesting things. But are they staying? Why are they here? Why are you all here if you live in Manchester? Why not in London or in Berlin or somewhere else? Okay, we've heard of people that were in Berlin. Well, so you can actually tell, even without doing any science, forget about it. You can just tell how well a city's doing by who's coming and who's going, who is it attracting, and who is leaving the city. So these are for U.S. cities, and there's a curious group of people that the American U.S. Census Bureau calls young, single, and educated. And you can just see where they go. And this is just for the largest cities in the U.S. So for example, San Francisco does very well. It's one of the richest, most innovative places in the U.S. does well partly because it has its own monoculture, not quite a monoculture, but it's quite specialized, especially Silicon Valley, on computer industry and web industry and so forth, which is the modern version of what is the most productive activity. And then you look at Detroit, and basically you see it's not holding on to the people that are coming in. You look at places like Boston, who are doing well, and it's one of the poster children of how well cities are doing in the U.S., and you find a big turnover. The point is that there's a huge turnover of people, always. And the interesting part is it positive or negative? Places like Pittsburgh, places perhaps like Manchester, from what some people have told me, are places that have good universities, that attract many people that want to come here and for a while anyway, and stake their life in the place, but the question is whether they stay over the long term. This is what happened to Detroit. Detroit basically is a city that's emptying out. Part of this had to do with increasing mobility, but basically it's all there. It just fell apart. And it fell apart in the center because there's no economic activity that's bringing people together. So you see this a lot. We're trying to develop models that do this, that basically take into account now the spatial parts of the city and the forces that are able to bring people together, namely things like economic activity, and other things like schools and cultural activity, and also then the mobility that people have. So what happened in Detroit is that these people in the suburbs in blue are basically able to benefit from the city during the day and then to leave the city at night. And this is increasingly happening to cities. I think looks like it's happening here too. So it's sort of interesting. So to summarize, cities basically concentrate people, effectively shrinking space. So it feels like space is shrunk. This is why the infrastructure is, you can save on it. It speeds up social interactions, and more interactions leads to good and bad things that we do socially. And it's sort of a balancing act to try to do that. So there's sort of an acceleration, a shrinkage, and this all contributes to what people do together. But there's no fundamental break between a small city and a large city. There's just this nonlinear acceleration of things. And so I just want to say something. According to my watch, I have 2 minutes and 46 seconds, so I'll use them. The talk was entitled Urban Futures, and so I want to say a little bit about that. As we look towards the future and we look at a planet that's increasingly urbanized, there are sort of crazy estimates, like, I don't know if they're crazy, but they're spectacular, that it will have about 80% of people in cities by 2050. That means everywhere on Earth will look like this. People just live in cities like they live now in developed countries. Now, how is this going to be achieved, and is it sustainable? You hear sort of these words thrown around a lot. And if you look at history and if you look at the numbers and the kind of studies that we're doing that I showed you, what you find is that there are things that are sort of, I'm not saying that they're done and they're easy, but there are things that we know how to do, like efficiencies in agriculture and other forms of basic materials. This is what's happening in the developing world. Part of the reason why prices are so high now for food is that there's an increasing urban population that even developing countries has more purchasing power. There's also, and there are fewer people farming, so there's going to have to be sort of a long overdue green revolution in some developing nations in the countryside that hasn't happened yet. But it's starting to happen, but there's a lag now. And there's the fact that some of this agriculture is being diverted to energy, and that's sort of the third point. Like in the US, much of the corn is now being diverted to ethanol to running cars, because that's so expensive. But that means that some food is not there. But all this is sort of we know how to do, and we need to find how to exploit these energies. But there's a sense that security and development is still the hardest problem. So I just want to show you some of these. So the answer seems not to be, since you're designers, and many of you are, the answer may not be sort of to design a city that's an ideal city. This is Henry Ford's vision of it. It's a city that basically eliminates dense neighborhoods and creates something idealized. And you got, this is really ominous one. It's basically a city against a nuclear war, so it has all kinds of design where people can escape and not be totally bombed. So it's very low density. And this is sort of the history of New York and US, but I think also Britain, in terms of just creating cities where people can escape from. And this is done in some sense from the inside out by building road infrastructure. This was never built, but this is why Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses had sort of an intellectual confrontation as to what a city should be. The other thing is that if you look at revolutions, uprisings, this always happens in cities. The French Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, the Russian Revolution, you name it. They were all basically expectations of people coming to cities that were unfulfilled, at least in the short term. There are a lot of people that lived in a very, that's my time. And so the question is, how are you going to deliver that in places that have either a lot of immigration in developing countries, or how is it that developed countries are going to deal with the immigration that they do get, which is beneficial ultimately, but still creates a lot of tensions. That problem, though there are solutions in history and there are ways in which one can see the benefits of those processes, it's still very hard to deal with. And finally, I just want to say, and I'll just flash a couple slides about energy use and some of the work we're doing recently. Namely, if you look at the problems of nations in terms of sustainability, this is a measure of human ecological footprint by nation, and the UK is that arrow there. You'll find that the biggest problem is CO2 emissions at the moment. So this is the way we use and derive energy. It's that purple bar there. You basically see that if that big purple bar would go away, the UK would be almost sustainable, and that's true of almost every nation. And so when you look at cities, you can there's increasingly new data on CO2 emissions, and which basically are measures of energy use in several sectors in cities. This is just starting to come up, and it is very rough. But what you find is basically the same sort of savings that you find in infrastructure, particularly in transportation. So cities, in some sense, you have that feeling. You just walk around, you take public transportation, you don't just drive. And the big difference really is that people have fewer cars in larger cities, and that is most of your energy budget in transportation, is to take people out of cars into cities. Now, there are a lot of policies to try to do that, and they tend not to be very efficient. But what you find is that just happens naturally in cities for two reasons. First, you can, because it's dense enough that you can walk around. And also at the same time, it's expensive to have a car. So it's just cities in some sense are greener. And sort of one of the jokes that New York, New York really is the greenest place in the United States in terms of urban use. So of use of energy. So there's sort of a dichotomy there that's interesting, but where the savings and the greenness of cities in some sense is a byproduct of other things that happen. So that's essentially the end of my talk. There's sort of a saying by E.O. Wilson, who you probably know if you read some of his books in biology. He basically says when he looks at a single ant, he studies ants, that an ant alone is no ant at all. It's sort of in the superorganism of the colony that an ant's potential to take over the earth, essentially, is fulfilled. And in that sense, it's also true of humans. The human, forgive, present company excluded, but a human alone, typically, is no human at all. It is sort of a disappointment. It is in looking at all the things we can do together that you really see the human potential. And that human potential is being fulfilled in cities, and cities yet to come. So an urban world will be faster, will be more volatile in the sense that I mentioned. It'll be more interesting in terms of new ideas and things produced. It'll be less material because of the necessary savings in infrastructure and materials. So the question, so we'll feel a lot more like this potentially, but the question is, can this work in a sense of in the economic sense, in the sense of our personal happiness? So that's where I want to leave it. I just want to acknowledge my colleagues. Jose Lobo is an urban economist who's basically, it's impossible to see, but it's been very important in all this work. Debbie Stromsky is our expert on patents and innovation. Jeffrey West is somebody I worked closely with who brought many of the ideas from biology, and Hei Jin Yoon is somebody who's a new postdoc is working on this carbon emissions data recently. So some of the papers are there, et cetera. So thank you very much. Sorry for overrunning.